Professor Arun Kumar is an expert in the areas of development economics, macroeconomics, public finance, and public policy. And UNAM Mexico has awarded him the Ricardo Prize in Economics for his work in development economics. He has authored the alternative budgets for 93 to 94 and 94 to 95, which proposed alternative economic policies for the country. He has also written extensively on globalization and on issues of public policy, both in academic journals and also in popular press media. And he has been contributing to public discussions on policy since 1980. His recent book, published in December 2020, which is titled Indian Economy's Greatest Crisis, Impact of the Coronavirus and the Road Ahead, has generated a lot of interest and discussion among scholars. And his other prominent works include Demonetization and the Black Economy and Brown Scorching Tax. It is a pleasure and honor to have you with us, sir. And in conversation with Professor Arun Kumar, we have Air Marshal Matheswaran, AVSM VM, President of the Peninsula Foundation. I also welcome the audience who have joined us today, and I hope you are looking forward to an interesting discussion. And I would also like to inform you that to please reserve your questions for the end, which can either be entered in the chat box or you can use the raise your hand option. I now request the Air Marshal to say a few words to welcome our guest and also set the scene for the conversation, please.
Thank you, Madhuvanti. And the Peninsula Foundation is extremely delighted to have Professor Arun Kumar with us today once again. We are at a very critical time in the international environment today, with a war going on between Russia and Ukraine, or rather the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, or as Putin puts it, special operations in Ukraine by Russia. And it's been going on for the last 24 days. Today is the 24th day. And this is, by some yardsticks, by some analysis, it's actually, I would say, is this an emerging great power transition, or is it a power transition contest that's actually showing up in a particular form? So there are larger issues that are involved. In the last 2 years, ever since the pandemic started and ever since Trump's trade war began, we were all focused on the conflict and the contest and the competition between Russia and, US and China. And the Russian issue had taken a back seat. And that came into the fore as Putin ramped up the whole process. But if you really look at it, this is a development that's gone on since the end of the Cold War and collapse of the Soviet Union. And Russia was weak in the 1990s. And this has been building up gradually. And what you've seen is Putin having built up Russia to a certain level of power and with an ambition to actually retrieve its great power status and its areas of influence, has been flagging various warnings over the last 20 years. And by some analysis, and people like John Mearsheimer, even Henry Kissinger, now say this war began in 2014, when the Americans and the European Union and the NATO exceeded their limits to provoke Russia. What we are interested in looking at today is what, the importance of sanctions. The US has imposed a series of sanctions on the Russian economy, and Russia is a great power. And it is not easy. It's not another small country on which sanctions can actually crumble that country's economy. It has a blowback on the rest of the world as well. And what would happen if this sanction continues to be there for a long time? The entire Western world is behind the US in imposing these sanctions as well. And that raises the question about, is this also a defining moment for restructuring the international economic order or the global economic order, which is dominated by the West, created by the US post-1945. And US has been frequently using the threat of sanctions on the rest of the world as well. And that falls outside the ambit of the UN as well. And therefore, lots of questions with respect to ethics, morals, and the reality of international contest between great powers that's actually emerging. And with not very far off, but as John Measham has said, there is a threat of nuclear conflagration far off, hanging at the background. And all this, I think, we need to analyze effectively. We must understand the implication of the sanctions, not only on Russia, on the global system, on India particularly, and of course, what it does to the international order. So let me invite Professor Arun Kumar to, initiate with this presentation, which here he has, which will lay down the foundations for the discussion subsequently. Professor Arun Kumar, yours.
Thank you, Marshal. Thanks to the Peninsula Foundation for inviting me to make this presentation. I'll start my presentation. Are you able to see the presentation? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Okay, all right. So basically, I'll be looking at the impact on Russia and the world of this war and the sanctions that have followed. So as an introduction, the war, in my judgment, is for strategic dominance, like was the case with the world wars. It's not an ideological fight. It's not as if there's a fight between capitalism and socialism, because Russia is now no more a socialist republic. The question also arises, why was NATO necessary after the collapse of Soviet Union and the communist bloc? And why has it been inching closer to the Russia's borders? I think those are strategic questions that also come into play. Russia, as Air Marshal has been pointing out, had been perceiving a growing threat from the Western powers. So the question is that there's a conflict which involves a military superpower, namely Russia, against a small neighbor, Ukraine, which is backed by the West. Now, NATO knows it cannot intervene militarily because of the threat of a wider conflagration. So therefore, it is trying to punish Russia by imposing sanctions, and the US is heading the sanctions, but NATO members are also a part of the sanctions that are being imposed. The issue is that will it halt the war? In my judgment, the sanctions will not stop the war. So Russia is trying to push for certain goals, and we have to see whether the sanctions will hurt Russia enough that they will regret the invasion of Ukraine that they have gone in for. So that's a question that needs to be looked at. On the other hand, if the pressures are greater for regime change in Moscow, and the recent news seems to suggest that West is trying for a regime change in Moscow, the way the news channels are saying that, if that sort of begins to play up, then the war may get ratcheted up, and then we don't know where we are headed. Now, the structure of the talk and the issues that will be there are in 4 parts. One is the impact on Russia, the other is the impact on the international situation, and in the short term and in the long term, because the consequences will play themselves out. Some will be immediate, some will be in the long run. And of course, the political and the economic issues are intertwined. They're not separated from each other. So there'll be political and economic issues that will come up in this context. Now, the question that arises also is that are the sanctions also a message to China? Yesterday, President Joe Biden and President Xi Jinping, they had a chat, and there was apparently a feeling there that if China cooperated with Russia, then it could also be sanctioned. So therefore, is it a message to China? We've had many sanctions recently, as Air Marshal pointed out. Of course, Iran has been sanctioned, but the Iranian economy is much smaller. The Russian economy is much bigger. And of course, it's technologically much more advanced than the Iranian economy. So therefore, we cannot draw the lessons from what happened in Iran for what might happen vis-a-vis the Russian economy and the Russian society. What I fear is that there's a danger of a Cold War between the Eastern Bloc of Russia and China on the one hand, and the rich nations on the other hand. as I said, this is not an ideological war, because now Russia and China are also, for all intents and purposes, capitalist countries. So it's a big power play that is going on in my judgment.
Professor, just one. Can you select the full screen mode on this?
Okay.
At the bottom,
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So today the world is also far more globalized than in the 1950s when the Cold War was there. So therefore, is the likelihood that the impact will be greater? That is something that we have to also understand. Now, I think yeah. So what are the questions about the sanctions that we need to keep in mind? What do the sanctions do? Theoretically, they convert a relatively open economy into a relatively closed one, because when you sanction, then everything gets disturbed. Your international relationships get disturbed. But of course, no economy is either completely closed or completely open. It's a question of degree. So in terms of degree, now the Russian economy will behave as a much more closed economy than the open economy that it had tended to become before the sanctions. So this sudden closure is like a shock to the economy. And therefore, the shock will have its implications. And what are the questions? There are 4 questions that come up. How open the economy was before the sanctions and how closed it becomes after their imposition. So the impact on the economy will depend on this sudden transition. And the second is how suddenly the sanctions are imposed and how much time the sanctioned economy takes to adjust to these sanctions. So the speed of adjustment, the sort of robustness of the sanctioned economy, that is important. Then, of course, how long the sanctions last. If the sanctions are for a very short time, then it'll have one implication. If they're for a long time, then of course there'll be other severe implications. And then how resilient is the sanctioned economy? That's the Russian economy. How resilient is it to be able to deal with it? How much can it adjust quickly? That will decide on this thing. And that will depend on the people of the country who are going to face the shock of the sanctions. What kind of steps they take. Are they very nationalistic, or is there a lot of dissent there? That will determine the impact on the Russian economy. Now, the first thing that will happen is that to prevent Russia from earning foreign exchange, exports are sanctioned. That means Russia will not be able to export as easily as it was doing earlier. And the extent of the size of the Russian economy is the 11th largest. It's about 2.5% of the world GDP. The linkages with the rest of the world are quite substantial. 39% of GDP, 25% are the exports, and 14% are the imports. So therefore, it's quite a connected economy. And the kind of sanctions, as is being said, they are very severe sanctions that are being imposed. So it's within this framework of the size, the connection with the rest of the world, and the kind of sanctions that the other things will play out. Now, Russia is a major exporter of oil and gas, and some critical raw materials like metals, like nickel and palladium and so on, also fertilizer, and also other critical elements for chip making like neon gas, etc. So some of the critical material which otherwise are in short supply in the rest of the world, they are being sanctioned. So that determines the impact on the rest of the world. Now we know that because Europe is heavily dependent on Russian oil and gas, therefore oil and gas export to Europe is not being sanctioned, and that's why India is also able to buy from Russia at a discounted price. And China will also buy because China will get very cheap energy from Russia. So this is the major source of foreign exchange earnings for Russia. As the data above suggests, they have 11% of GDP as the surplus in their foreign exchange earnings from export and import. So as long as this continues, the export ban will not have that much of an effect on the Russian economy. Now, of course, the payments, suppose, the West says we are not going to pay for whatever we are getting, then Russia could just stop the export and that would disrupt the world economy very substantially. And whatever is not exported to the West could be exported to other countries like India and China. China would love to get supplies of oil and gas from Russia. It's already talking about a second pipeline, a major investment on that, so that it could get from Siberia. Sanctioning Russian exports, therefore, will be a double-edged sword, because not only will the Russian economy get disturbed, the rest of the world, which has been facing supply bottlenecks after the pandemic, those supply bottlenecks will aggravate. Already in the world economy, metal prices and other prices like crude, etc., had been going up, and sanctions of these items from Russia will therefore further lead to inflation in the world economy. But of course, if the exports decline, there's no doubt the Russian economy will be impacted. And I'll come back to the question of how much. Then the imports are also being sanctioned. That means whatever Russia buys from the rest of the world, there also there's sanctions. So they'll not supply many of the things. But then, of course, many of the things that were going into Russia were luxury items for the wealthy. Now, that will not have as much of an impact on the Russian economy as other things like electronics and automobiles and such like things. But the point is that China can easily step in and supply these, because China has become the manufacturing power of the world. So if China does not join the sanctions, then they can substitute for these items that were coming from the West. Now, it's possible that those quality may be less, or Russia can try and manufacture some of them. Or if some of these plants in Russia are closed, then the Russians could nationalize those plants and run them. And there's a threat that Russia might do that. So I think it's possible that some of the things that are being imported could either be made within Russia very quickly, or could be obtained from China. India is also unlikely to join the sanctions, given its dependence on Russian defense equipment, which I'm told is about 60%, but Air Marshal would know better. There'd be a problem about payments. That is the alternate mechanism of payment to SWIFT, because SWIFT has been closed to large number of Russian banks, but 2 banks have not been shut out of SWIFT, because that's where Europe pays money to Russia. So that route is available for trade to continue between India and Russia, or China and Russia. In addition, China already has an alternative to SWIFT called CIPS, and Russia has a small alternative called SPFS. Both China and Russia could expand this and make members from other countries, the banks of other countries, members of that, so as to enable trade to continue. So a limited amount of trade would continue with Russia, and Russia having a trade surplus would be an advantage, because then it will be able to pay for whatever it's buying without any difficulty.
Professor, you have to select your full screen mode. It's still not on full screen.
Is it? But I'm getting full screen now.
Oh, I see. Can you?
Here I have got full screen.
Then are others getting it full screen? Because I'm getting messages that it's not on full screen.
Oh.
No, it's not in full screen for me either.
So you could just maybe stop sharing and come back again, share it again, probably. I think it's probably hanging something.
Okay, let me see if I can.
Otherwise, on the you can just select the presentation mode.
Well, that's what I'm trying to do.
That doesn't seem to work there. So you can go on to the.
Can it now? Has it now come full screen again?
No.
No. Okay. Let me see. Because you see, the top is being covered by where.
Now that should go off in the full screen mode. So go to the from the current slide.
Has it come now, full screen?
Not yet.
No. Somehow then it's not letting.
There's a presentation mode somewhere, correct? This is fine. This is okay.
think this is the best I'm able to do.
Okay, no problem. Okay, we'll just continue.
Okay, so beyond the trade of export and import, there's also financial sector sanctions that have been brought in. So the question is, if the trade sanctions do not work, I think the advanced nations are thinking that the financial sector sanctions would hurt. And the financial sector, sanctions consist of shutting out many of the Russian banks from SWIFT, as I mentioned earlier, but two are left. Western companies are pulling out their investment in Russian companies. So various oil companies and others, or like McDonald's, have closed their stores in Russia. Then freezing of the assets of Russian central bank. Of the $600 billion of reserves, $300 billion have been frozen. Freezing of the assets of oligarchs and the leadership. Like it is said that we are freezing the assets of Putin and of Lavrov and so on and so forth. Now, what it has done is it has created a negative sentiment about Russia, and that's why the share prices of Russian stocks declined very sharply. The value of ruble fell very quickly as soon as these sanctions were levied. And in front of the banks and ATMs in Russia, long queues appeared. So this negative sentiment already had an immediate impact. But the point is that MNCs that have announced sale of their stake in Russian firms, will they be able to sell their stake? And indeed, it's not likely, because Russia has closed its stock market. So therefore, the stocks cannot be sold within Russia, and stocks will not be able to be sold outside Russia, because nobody will buy them. Because of the sanctions, there'll be no buyers. So it could have only sold within Russia, and then the money could be taken out. But that has been prevented by the closure of the stock market and the Russian central bank not allowing capital to go out. So therefore, these steps are not going to have much of an impact immediately. So the point is that if Russia does not follow conversion of ruble to foreign exchange in the economy, the demand for dollar will remain low and ruble will not fall further. So whatever has been the fall in ruble, it is not going to fall any further. And the freezing of the central bank accounts by rich countries would also not matter at the present if capital is not allowed to leave Russia. Because if capital had been going out in large quantities, then the freezing of reserves would matter. But if Russia doesn't allow capital to go out of Russia, then the freezing of central bank assets would not really matter. Freezing of accounts of kleptocrats and the leaders who have accounts abroad would be a personal hit for these people who are targeted, but not for the economy, because that was already outside. So whatever is outside, if you're not allowing that to come in, that really doesn't matter, because it was not going to come in anyway. Russians withdrawing funds from banks is likely to be just temporary, because as long as sufficient liquidity is provided by the central bank, they'll be able to get the money, and then the panic would stop. It's only the dollar accounts where, if people are allowed to withdraw in dollars, that could have created a problem, but that's not being allowed. So therefore, that also will not create a problem. So certainly the financial sanctions would disrupt the economy in the short run, as the decline of the ruble and so on has taken place. And with the decline of ruble, the inflation would rise. But the point is that when you minimize the capital outflows and on trade account, you continue to have surpluses, then the impact of these sanctions, whether the financial sanctions or the trade sanctions, that would be minimized. But the impact could be very severe on the Western institutions who had lent to Russia. And some payments are falling due within the next few days. Now, if Russia refuses to pay, then the liquidity problem for those who had lent to Russia, who are not getting the interest, their credit rating, etc., would go down. So some of the Western institutions would begin to suffer if Russia refuses to pay and defaults on its obligations to pay. And Russian assets being frozen, they would legitimately claim that if you've frozen our assets, we're not going to repay your institutions. So therefore, there's a double-edged sword here as well. Now, medium-term impact, as the economy becomes relatively closed, foreign transactions will decline in importance. So these foreign transactions like capital inflows and outflows, etc., their importance would be much less if you are talking about a closed economy with relatively less interaction with the rest of the world. Ruble will decline in value in the short run, leading to higher inflation, as I mentioned. But in the long run, because of the surpluses that are already there in the trade account, I don't think the impact will be too great as long as Russia can set up its trade with China, with India, and with the other countries. So therefore, that will also not make too much of an impact on the ruble. Of course, the rate of investment in the economy will decline because of the war requirements. Capital would have to be diverted to war production, and that could impact the growth rate of the economy. The production would have to be revamped, and if that is properly done, then investment would be required. But with some belt tightening, it's possible that growth could remain robust because you'd want to produce not only for the war effort, but for what has been sanctioned. And given the technology that's already available in Russia, it's possible that they could do it. So denial of technology will hurt in the medium term, but Russia is advanced enough to develop its own technology. So in the short run, this denial of technology is unlikely to have much of an effect on the Russian economy. And what of the long run? In the long run, the impact of sanctions would depend on relations with China, because China is a big manufacturing hub. So China would worry about the sanctions against it in the future. China was already facing problems from the West, whether it be Quad, the South China Sea, and various other things. So China would be wary that it could be sanctioned in the future. And that's why my feeling is that a bloc between Russia and China would emerge, and that will give China greater depth. It'll have access to raw materials and access to Russian technology. So the world, in my judgment, in the long run, is headed towards the emergence of two blocs. Even if the war ends soon and sanctions are withdrawn, I think we are headed towards two blocs, because I think the trust between the two groups, that trust is at a very low ebb. If that happens, if there are two blocs, then there'll be two circles of trade, two circles of technology development, capital and financial flows. And if the war persists over time and the economy hurts, then Russia may become more belligerent. And the rich nations would be under pressure to be more proactive vis-a-vis Russia, which would spoil the relationships further, the trust would break further. Also, as far as the rich nations are concerned, if the sanctions don't bite and Russians are able to continue, then they'd be under pressure to do more. And what that more would be, that's not spelled out at the moment, but that is a danger sign. So either way, I see that the situation could spill out of control if the war persists or if the sanctions persist for much longer. And that's something that we have to watch out for. Now, in the international situation, in the short run, global trade is already impacted due to the sanctions and the supply bottlenecks that have been created. Energy, commodity, and food prices will rise due to the additional bottlenecks. There were already bottlenecks that were being created because of supply bottlenecks. So inflation will kick up everywhere, and purchasing power of majority will be hit. Like in the Indian context, we know that the unorganized sector has lost a lot of employment and income. And when prices go up, then their purchasing power will be further hit. And they are 94% of the workforce of India. So this kind of similar situation will be there everywhere. International capital flows will decline because various countries would want capital to recede to the home country. So that will impact the financial markets, which we already see that the stock markets decline very sharply to begin with. At the moment, they have risen a little bit, but in the long run, I think, the chances are that the stock markets will decline because of the rising uncertainty. We don't really know what steps will take place, how long the war will last, etc. Private investment will be impacted negatively because if consumption goes down due to inflation and due to loss of employment, then private investment could be hit. If that happens, then the growth rates that were already hit by the pandemic will again be adversely impacted. Military expenditures will rise everywhere because there'll be a lot more military expenditures because there'll be more mutual suspicions and so on. And that will always be at the expense of the social sector expenditures on things like education, health, drinking water, and so on and so forth. It's very likely that authoritarianism will rise everywhere because the rulers will always say that there's a crisis and they need to do certain things. And so therefore, authoritarianism may rise in various countries. So priority to the pandemic control will decrease we already see to a certain extent the dramatic rise in the Omicron BA2 variant in large parts of Europe, in large parts of Southeast Asia. So it appears that the pandemic control may receive less attention, and vaccine inequity will rise as a result, because nations would say we have to take care of us. And if vaccine inequity rises in Africa, where less than 10% have been vaccinated, the virus would continue to proliferate and mutate, and new variants will keep coming. Now, in the long run, the pandemic had already induced a new normal. Now, with the war and the sanctions, newer elements will get introduced in it. As I said, the trust between key global nations that will be shattered. The Cold War will last long, as far as I can see. With China and Russia, they'll be pushed closer to each other. So the strategic relations globally, I think, are going to shift. The rich nations will be seen to be unreliable, having deserted Afghanistan recently and left Ukraine on its own. Competition for influence in different countries will increase from both blocs. There'll be a lot of competition that will go on. Trade will be impacted in the long term with uncertain consequences. And these two trading and financial blocs that will emerge will create their own problems of globalization. Countries will have to choose between the two blocs, like during the Cold War, and developing countries may have a greater choice between the two blocs, but it's very likely that the capital flows will decrease, and therefore the kind of capital flows that the developing world was getting would decline. So in spite of greater choice, I think the benefit may not come. The military-industrial complex everywhere will be strengthened. Unemployment will decline as armament is destroyed and rebuilt. Investment in social sectors will be adversely impacted, aggravating poverty. And research and development will accelerate, and technology stocks will do well. Authoritarianism will grow, with both sides backing authoritarian leaders loyal to them. There could also be pressure for regime changes, and therefore certain countries could get destabilized as a result of greater competition for their thing. So as a conclusion, a relatively less open economy with trade surplus and with trade partners to supplement its production will adjust to sanctions. So I see that Russia can adjust given its relation with China and its huge trade surplus that it has because of its production of some critical raw materials. But Russia and the world economy will be adversely impacted immediately, but over a period of time, whether they can adjust, that's what we have to see. This will bring a new form of globalization. It won't be the kind of globalization that we have seen since the 70s, where trade and capital flows, etc., were accelerating. But now this will be in two different blocks with competition and with the less capital available globally. The military-industrial complex will prosper as the war persists, and that would impact the marginalized sections. A strategic play will be there between the superpowers. That's why we need to resolve the problem and bring an end to the war. War never helps anybody. Russia should withdraw, and NATO needs to dissolve itself so that Russia doesn't feel threatened by an outside force. So there could be a resolution that could be built by the two contending powers. And for India, I think the lesson is to stay out of big power rivalry. It's easier said than done, but I think we are now squeezed between our dependence on Russian arms and so on, and between what we've been buying from the West in the last 15 years. So what we need is strategic independence, which requires increased focus on education, R&D, and various other things if we are to cope with the kind of situation that we have landed ourselves in. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Professor. That's been very comprehensive coverage. Unfortunately, your slides didn't move, but I think people would have heard and monitored the complete coverage. Let me raise with a fundamental question. And starting off from where you mentioned that the world is likely to move into two blocks. So starting off from post-1945, the global architecture, we didn't enter into a Cold War, but the architecture, the financial architecture has been largely US driven, and therefore after the Cold War, it's become entirely a US dominated system. The US reserve currency virtually dominates the whole process. And this, I believe, the US has used it as a coercive instrument in its strategy to impose its dominance as well as get countries to behave in the way they want them to behave as well. So have we reached an inflection point with this war where when you say there's going to be two blocks, and the two blocks will then need to actually dissociate themselves from an existing financial architecture, which means will there be a threat to the reserve currency? Most countries like India's, much like Russia's, India's reserve currency, foreign exchange reserves are largely in dollars and euros, right? And,
Yes.
and in one of the, contrary to popular perception that when you have large reserves, you are actually strong. On the other hand, the US has now demonstrated that it can, take control of your reserves and still coerce you to behave in a way they want you to behave, right? And therefore, the confidence level of the US-led, financial architecture has taken a beating with the sanctions program that they've unleashed in this particular war. So when you say two blocks are going to form, the situation is quite different today as compared to the Cold War. This block is going to be largely determined by financial architectures. Am I right in saying that?
So you're right, the financial architecture will also change when the two blocks form. So for instance, freezing the Russian banks out of SWIFT, and if they impose sanctions on China and they freeze Chinese banks also out of that. And this is a threat that both Russia and China have been feeling, and that's why they have been trying to create an alternative to the SWIFT. So SPFS by Russia and CIPS by China, they are already functioning, though of course not at the same level as the SWIFT, which has 11,000 member banks. But very quickly this can be ramped up because many countries would still want to trade with China and with Russia. So I think this global financial architecture is going to change. And that's why I said there'll be two circles of finance, two circles of trade, two circles of technology development. Because as it is, US is not going to share advanced technology with these China and Russia. They'll have to develop their own advanced technology for the moment. So as far as I can see, the global financial architecture, which as you rightly said, was dominated by USA because of the dollarization of the world economy, that I think is an era that is going. Now, one aspect of that, of course, is the cryptos. Cryptos have been coming in, and they're now more than $2.5 trillion worth globally. So therefore, in a sense, already the rich kleptocrats and the Ukrainians, they're already using these cryptos. So if there are any problems vis-a-vis dollars, then people could start trading using cryptos, and that will be very difficult for the USA to control. So in a sense, new currencies, and there are about 10,000 such cryptos. So Bitcoin is the best known, but there are 10,000 such currencies, whether stable coins or altcoins and Bitcoin-like cryptos. So I think we are already headed in that direction where the money markets and the financial markets were going to be disturbed by the progress in the cryptos. So in a sense, with China and Russia on the one hand, and the Western nations on the other hand, there'll be further disturbance, and there'll be further issues that will come up. We'll have to see, wait and watch how this develops. But I see that these, because Russia and China are quite large, they're not like Iran or North Korea and so on. So I think sanctions will not have the kind of bite that they may have had on Iran or North Korea. So in spite of the US control, dollars, etc., as I said, the Russians just simply will freeze, their relationship. That means they'll not allow capital to go out or capital to come in. And therefore, they'll be able to manage the foreign exchange problems that they have. Of course, it'll mean that the ruble will not be traded globally, but then they don't care. They can set up the trade in like ruble rupee trade that was there earlier. We are already hearing that Indian oil is buying from them. So if Indian oil buys and uses the rupee ruble trade, then I think it's possible to continue to trade outside the dollar framework. So it'll weaken the American dominance of the financial markets as well. But
is it possible to now move towards eliminating? No, we moved from gold standard to a basket of currencies, and the American dollar became the universal reserve currency. Is there a way in which, although the two blocks can form, but I think the globalization process is quite irreversible, and countries would like to trade with each other and move, goods and services. So, is there a possibility of dollar as a reserve currency being virtually removed or diluted to an extent wherein the dollar domination then collapses and an alternative can come in? Not the crypto is a little long way off, but I suppose in any other format. Or can we go back to the gold standard all over again?
No, I think going back to the gold standard is not going to happen. I mean, the world economy has become too large for currencies to be backed by gold. I don't think that's going to come. But cryptos, look at the speed at which it's gone up.
Yes.
I mean, it's now more, assets of more than $2.5 trillion, which is more than the amount of gold in the world. So, the speed at which, in the next 3 to 4 years, I'm told, especially if people begin to move away from dollars to cryptos as a result of this, then I think that's a possibility. But as I said, China has more than $3.5 trillion of reserves, and that can support, its currency. So I think it's possible that China could emerge as an alternate pole where trade could take place using the Chinese currency or the ruble or some combination of the two. So I think it's looks to me that the dollarization of the world economy, which has been going on since the 70s, that I think is now going to change. And regarding globalization that you mentioned, globalization, as I said, will be in different form. Globalization at the moment was also dominated by the Western controlled institutions, whether it be IMF, World Bank, WTO, and so on. That I think could also change because new institutions would emerge to replace, in the other bloc, the Eastern bloc, there'd be newer institutions that would emerge, which would then have the same role that IMF or World Bank or others played. And because there'd be two blocks of trade, the nature of trade would change. The two financial circles, one dominated by the dollar and the Western currencies like euro or yen, and the other by the Chinese currency and the Russian currency. So I think the nature of the change is to be seen in the coming years. But in the long run, I think all this is going to change as far as I can see.
What about BRICS? Will it strengthen the process that BRICS emerged in the early 2000s? Everybody said probably BRICS could be, are they thinking about replacing the Bretton Woods institution, the IMF, World Bank, etc., by bringing in their own institutions? Will this process strengthen their hand even better? And so will they become an alternative?
Yeah, so China had already set up a bank, in Beijing, which was to replace the ADB and the IMF in a sense. That will, I think, strengthen now that kind of move. And China has enough surpluses to invest in other countries. It's already been investing large sums in Africa. India gave funds of about $1 billion. They went in with $50 billion. The One Belt, One Road, that was also a move to try and expand their markets. So those kind of things have already been going on. And I think now that's where I said the way all that happens will change because the two blocks will try for influence in the different countries. So what the Chinese have been doing in terms of expanding their toehold over the rest of the world, that is going to change because I think the West is going to resist that more. So that's where I see that China realizes that strategically, even though at this point the fight is with Russia, but very quickly it could turn into a struggle vis-a-vis Russia and China on the one hand and the rich nations on the other hand. And that's why my feeling is that we are into a situation of Cold War between the two blocs. And even if the war ends soon, even if the sanctions are removed, I think we are going to be in two blocs and we must start thinking about it. What all will change as a result of that and where India's interest lies and how can we protect India's interest? I think we have to begin thinking about that now.
That's right. Absolutely. I think we entered the Cold War to 2.0 as quite clearly events indicate. But looking at China, has it actually played to the advantage of China in terms of their BRI strategy? Where one of the American analysis very clearly says the largest strategy of BRI is to create an Eurasian system which becomes Sino-centric economic order. And will this accelerate that process?
Yes, as I said, there'll be difficulties because now that will be resisted more than what has been resisted. Already resistance were taking place because West had realized, India had realized, and that's why India was not part of the BRI. Okay, that BRI was to expand the footprint of China. China is using its surpluses to expand into Africa, into other continents like Latin America and so on. It's been doing that. So this is a process that is now going to continue and maybe with greater intent. But I think the resistance from the West will be much greater because the West also realizes that strategically that would be to its disadvantage. So the West would step up and would, that's why I said the competition in the developing world will increase between the two blocks. And that could destabilize many of the governments. And that's where, authoritarianism could rise globally, and also, destabilization of governments in various countries. Both these processes could take place, and we have to be aware of that and plan for that.
I have a question on the military-industrial complex. I'll come to that later. Let me invite the audience to, you can raise your hand or put your questions on the chat box. If anybody has a question, please come up, raise your hand, and you can ask the question to the professor. There is one question in the chat box that I see here is, will gold become the basis of trade between India and Russia? And can crypto be used when amount to be moved around in huge amount? Would you like to answer that question?
Yeah. So I don't see gold really as the basis, because as I said, gold as a basis, given the huge expansion of the world economy, gold backing is not possible anymore. But I think mechanisms like there was the earlier mechanism of rupee trade, those kind of mechanisms I think will come up, where you discuss the parity between ruble and rupee and you trade as per that. So that would depend on the bundle of commodities that you're trading, and that should be the way. Now, crypto's use is not easy. I have written articles on this in December saying why for normal day-to-day use, cryptos are not easy to use. Cryptos work more as an asset, but over a period of time, they could also begin to work as currency. But Bitcoin, the protocols are very, very heavy. They use a lot of energy and a lot of computing power. And then there has to be consensus, which is not going to be easy. But then there are stable coins and others which could be used more for transaction purposes. Then the banks or central banks are thinking of central bank digital currency. Now, central bank digital currency, in my judgment, is not like a crypto. It is a digital currency rather than a crypto. Now, things like that will emerge that will enable trade to take place more easily than using the dollars. So, that's why I said there'll be big changes in the financial system that I see coming. And we need to prepare, our central bank needs to prepare, our banking system needs to prepare. So we may, make one small bank from India, the nodal bank for payments vis-a-vis, say, Russia, by making it a part of the SPFS. So even if it is sanctioned, it will not impact the rest of the trade that the other big banks do. So like in the case of Iran, what we did was that we managed to develop a way of trading with them, even though we stopped importing oil from them. So similar mechanisms can be developed because the Russia and China together are very large. But I think what Air Marshal was hinting at was the Chinese advantage in all this. China, along with the Russia, China would have an advantage now vis-a-vis the rest of the world.
Okay, so here's a question from Mr. Ramachandran. If the world will have Cold War and two blocks, will there be a non-aligned movement again led by India? That's one. And a second question from Aditya Subramani is, how do you expect the potential rise of a Russia-China bloc to play out for India-Russia relations?
Okay. Non-aligned will, of course, return because the developing world would probably try and play one bloc against the other bloc, like used to happen in the 60s and the 50s. That's possible. But as I said, the competition will be much stronger from the two blocs to try and incorporate different nations. And that could lead to regime changes. So non-alignment to a certain extent, but given that capital flows will decline, that kind of aid that was available to the developing world earlier, that I don't think is going to come back at this point of time. So yes, there'll be non-aligned, some countries would be non-aligned, but even this non-alignment was not quite working under WTO because the developing world is very, very diverse. So for instance, in the Uruguay round of negotiations and the formulation of the Dunkel draft and then the signing at Marrakesh, they could play some developing countries against others because some were exporters of agriculture produce, some were importers, and the interests of importers and the exporters were different. So the advanced countries could play these differences very easily to keep the developing world divided. Similarly, in the Uruguay round of negotiations, initially the developing world made India and Brazil the lead negotiators with the developed countries, and both India and Brazil then collapsed, and we could not take an independent position. In the Doha round, of course, the developing world with China took a more unified position, but still we could not stand to the stand up to the developed world, and we still have a disadvantage in trade vis-a-vis the developed world. So I think non-alignment would be somewhat different from the kind of non-alignment that we saw in the 50s and 60s, when I think the leadership of the non-aligned world, the developing world, was also very strong. And there was a certain post-colonial mentality. That post-colonial mentality in the world, that is no more there. So I think that the non-alignment would also be very different. Just like the Cold War would be very different from what it was in the 50s and 60s, the non-alignment would also be different. Now, the other question was regarding the rise of
Russia, China, and its impact on India, Russia.
Yeah. So the rise of Russia-China axis would mean that China would put pressure on Russia not to supply arms to us. And as it is, given the Russian war effort, I think the supplies of weapons and the spare parts to India would decrease. So in a sense, India would have a disadvantage vis-a-vis China, and the greater cooperation between Russia and China and India's neutrality at this point of time. We are not going against Russia. We are not going in favor of the West, means that we are not gaining brownie points with either Russia or with the Western powers, and both are going to squeeze us. So I think we are in a very unenviable position at this point of time, and that's why I said that we have to think about our strategic, relationships very quickly. That was my last point, because we have not really been able to take care of technology. And I think the big issue is technology. If we don't develop our technology, and that's why education and technology are very crucial, we will not be able to gain advantage in the world. So we need to really switch policies, but that takes time. Technology doesn't develop overnight. It takes good 10, 15 years for technology and for higher education to be revamped. And we need to do that.
In fact, we are paying the price for her not having had a a very viable strategy over the last 70 years in terms of technology control and technology development. There are two more questions, which is from Rajiv Kumar is one. Isn't it an opportunity for India to seek transfer of technology from Russia, considering Russia's limitations? And the second one again from Ramachandran is, the Chinese have a great trade exposure to the West. Can they afford to completely alienate the West?
Yeah, so, we could try and press Russia for technology transfer, but if we don't support them, either we join the bloc. If we don't join the bloc, why would Russia transfer technology to us? Whatever it has been doing, whether, Sukhoi manufacture, big manufacture, frigates manufacture, etc. Some amount we have got, but I don't think we are going to get much more, given that we are not really going in for closer relationship with them. So I don't think we can use the present moment to try and ask them to do more technology transfer to us. And China, yes, China has a huge trade with the rest of the world, is the manufacturing power. Now, if they try and sanction China, then the supply bottlenecks will increase dramatically. And therefore, the global situation will change dramatically as well. So even though USA is threatening China with sanctions if it helps Russia, I think it's a very strong double-edged sword. I think China and the rest of the world realize that if China is sanctioned, the whole world trade would get distorted, prices would get distorted, inflation would take place, growth would collapse. I think the world would go into a deep recession. So I think it'll be very, let's wait and watch how the West copes with the fact that Russia and China begin to collaborate more. I don't think it's a done thing that, because China has a huge trade with the rest of the world, it can be sanctioned, but it'll be sanctioned at the expense of everybody.
That's true. And we're coming to the end. So let me ask two more questions. One is, of course, you already answered, is that Russia's going to be financially hampered by the sanction. I think in your entire coverage, you've answered that part. Madhuvati has a question. What are the consequences of Russian decree suspending IP rights, intellectual property rights for unfriendly countries is one. And Ajay Lohani is asked, keeping in view the pull and push by Russia and the US, what are the options for India besides remaining neutral at present?
Yeah, so, temporarily you can suspend, these IPR rights because you're not going to get advanced technology from the West. Forget it. Russia did not get advanced technology from the West in any case because there's too much of suspicion. So it's not as if in the future they're going to get it. So if you have sanctions against you, you can easily suspend the intellectual property rights and continue to manufacture. So, for instance, many of the companies that are withdrawing from Russia, Russians could easily nationalize them and continue the production because the manpower is there, the technology is already there, the factories are already there. So you could continue manufacture there. And let us not forget that Russia does have a lot of technology available. And along with China, the two together have a lot of technology that's available for most of the things that they require. So I don't think, at this point of time, if you squeeze the technology transfers, etc., is going to have any major impact on Russia. In the long run, unless they develop, technology, they'll be at a disadvantage. So Russians will themselves think of developing more technology over the long run, and they'll put in more effort on R&D, and they can do it because they've done it in the past. Even when the Iron Curtain was there, they were way behind the Western Bloc, and still they managed to develop the critical technology that they needed for defense and other things. I think they could do that also now. So that I don't think is going to have. Now, regarding options for India, as I said, we are very badly stuck. We are not going with the Russians, we are not going with the West, and we don't have the independent standing to be able to take care of our own requirements. So how will we cope with sanctions? Because I think now on S-400, CAATSA may be implemented on India. Because earlier, of course, there was not the Ukraine-Russia war. So, the US could overlook CAATSA and things like that. But I think now, it'd be very difficult. There'll be pressure in the Congress to implement CAATSA on India. There'll be pressures that if India buys oil, already there's a noise being made in Britain and USA that India is buying oil and diesel from Russia. So all these things are already happening, and we will have very difficult time, I think, in the coming months. So our hope is that the war ends quickly and, some settlement is done quickly so that these things don't proliferate and don't expand too much. Then we'll have more space to continue. So it's in our interest that peace is restored. It's in the global interest that peace comes quickly. And for that, an agreement has to be reached between NATO and Russia, Ukraine and Russia.
Absolutely. Ambassador Rajagopalan, would you want to make any comments, sir?
Thank you, Matheswaran. Thank you, Professor Arun Kumar. It was indeed a very illuminating talk, a subject which is difficult to be with in an hour or so. But thank you. There were many new ways to look at it, which I picked up. These sanctions are not sanctions which we are all used to earlier. Any bad boy was sent to bed without dinner. That was the first type of sanctions. But here we found it was weaponizing of the international monetary institutions per se. International monetary systems have been weaponized, which is unprecedented. And I don't know whether anybody thought it through when establishing these far-reaching sanctions. But Professor Arun Kumar really analyzed it. Lots of questions were posed to him. So thank you, Professor Arun Kumar. I have just one comment to offer, is that sanctions per se can never influence the desired results. I think that's an axiom which one used whenever we found, the big boys behaving differently. Even, CATSA is something that is like the old Dulles axiom of you're not with me, then you're against me sort of a principle. But this time, these sanctions have gone beyond all that. And thank you for telling us about India. The word neutral, or we heard the word non-aligned. I think the best way to discuss is that this was a problem created by the Europeans among themselves. They should have they had many, many years to get rid of it. Between 92 and 2022, you had exactly 30 years to get rid of this whole issue after the Soviet Union collapsed. The Soviet Union collapsed not because of the West or anyone, because of the Federation president and the Ukrainian president wanting it. So that's what is history all about. They should have, and I don't think we need to take a stand per se on any matter and every matter. We have to look after our interests. Professor Arun Kumar did come out with some of them. Our interests, how do you look after it? Beyond that, one doesn't have to be actively pro or anti. One don't have to be neutral on all aspects, or non-aligned, as we say. And so I think what we are doing is the right one, and I think we should continue with that policy. Thank you, Matheswaran, for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Ambassador. And let me invite Professor Arun Kumar for his concluding remarks with a question, which is, as the Ambassador pointed out, the problem is actually from 1992, ever since the Soviet Union collapsed. And if you look at the American strategy, explained by Paul Wolfowitz as well as Zbigniew Brzezinski, the strategy has been to actually push away Russia, reduce their influence, and it has an economic and technological impact, and suck in the former East European countries into European Union, NATO, and into the American orbit. The larger interest is actually to benefit the American economy and the Western economy by getting them integrated into their economies. And more importantly, the military-industrial complex of the US then sells all arms to these countries, and they become their, when their customers. The same approach is there with India, because they want us to wean away from Russia and be completely dependent on the US as their, customer for very important high technology arms. So how do you look at the role of the military-industrial complex? In every war that America has intervened, the military-industrial complex has made profits enormously, including in Afghanistan. And here now they are pumping in weapons. And they are going to make a lot of money by creating more problems in Ukraine. Probably they are happy to have a long drawn-out insurgent war with Russians in Ukraine for a long time. But in the bargain, much of the Eastern Europe and the Central Europe will fall into their, ambit. So is this the real danger? And this has been planned not overnight. I'm saying it's planned probably ever since the end of the Cold War. Is that true?
So, it's very difficult to decipher, in the abstract, what the long-term planning may have been. But of course, there'd be military strategists on both sides who be planning, for these long-term things. And you're right that the military-industrial complex would love a war, because, you produce equipment and you damage it and you burn it, and then you produce more of it, and therefore orders increase, and then the insecurity in the world goes up, and when the insecurity goes up, then other nations also buy more armament, you offer more newer armament, you experiment with your new machines, and you then develop more R&D and more newer machines. All this has an implication for the poor people of the world, because the defense budgets, as they go up, they'll always go up at the expense of, expenditures on development. So as people say, whenever military expenditures go up, then there's also a technology shortage because the best technology is used for military purposes. And therefore that leads to inflation because high technology then becomes less available for civilian use. So inflation kicks up, that impacts the poor people again. So poor people get impacted both on the technology front, as well as shortages, as well as diversion of national resources towards defense use, etc. So globally, I think what we'll see are disparities rising, and that will be bad, for the overall growth of the economy. So even though you'll have employment, because when you produce more and more armament, then of course there'll be more and more demand and employment, but disparities will rise. Then there's also a danger that Japan and Germany are again going to militarize. Both of them have said they're going to increase their expenditure. So that's an indication of how different countries globally will start increasing. And when that happens, then it's always at the expense of the other developing world. So I think the danger for the developing world is also rising, that their regimes will get destabilized. Authoritarianism will rise globally because people will be worried more about security than about development. So all told, this is going to set a new kind of a strategic architecture globally, both in terms of politics, in terms of economics, and in terms of social aspects. So what we need to do is prepare for the long run. I think where we've been weak in India is we've never prepared for the long run. We've always thought in the short run. The long run needs to be meshed in with our short run policies. We have not done that. And that's why today we are suffering. So for instance, because of our weakness in technology, we the day before RCEP was to be signed, we were about to sign and we withdrew. And we withdrew because we were worried that China would take advantage of RCEP. But then when we withdraw, then the same nations we trade with, and we'll trade outside the RCEP, so we'll not have the advantage. So we'll have to go for bilateral negotiations, which will mean that we'll not be able to get the right terms that we could have got. So whether we join RCEP or we are outside RCEP, we suffer. So this has been the story because our technology is very weak. We don't have a strategic view of where the nation stands and how the nation needs to cope with the global challenges. So we really need to get our act together in terms of devising our strategic interests and taking care of our strategic interests in India.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Professor Arun Kumar. It's been a delightful conversation we've had. There are a few more questions, but we've run out of time. So everything has to come to an end. So once again, on behalf of the Peninsula Foundation, it's a great pleasure to have had you this evening, and your exposition has been wonderful, extremely enlightening. Let me invite Madhavanti to do the closing honors. Madhavanti.
Thank you, sir. It was a very illuminating and an engaging discussion of the role and impact of sanctions in the Ukraine crisis. And I'm sure the discussion has also given us better clarity on what are the implications of such sanctions for the rest of the world. So on behalf of the Peninsula Foundation, I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Arun Kumar for spending time and sharing his thoughts and his take on the most important issue of the hour with us. And I would also like to thank Air Marshal for taking the conversation forward in an interesting way. And I also thank the audience for their participation, your questions, and also interest in our event. And I hope you all enjoyed today's discussion and hope to see you soon at another interesting event. Thank you.
Thanks for the organizers for organizing this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Great pleasure having you today. Thank you.
Thank you.